This presentation is based on the original teachings from the YouTube channel Estudio Biblia in Spanish. If you speak Spanish, I encourage you to visit the original channel. Without further ado, let's continue with part 2 of the Ki Tov series. Welcome back to Bible Study, a continuation of the concept of Ki Tov. We had been discussing that Ki Tov is a perfect structure, ideal for reestablishing and restoring our being. Now, we are going to properly see how we find Tov within created things, within the stories in Scripture that reinforce what was discussed in the previous video. So, if you haven't watched the first video, I encourage you to go back and watch the first part in order to follow along with this second video. Now then, let's look at the Tov hidden within creation. It says that the word Tov appears 7 times during the 6 days of creation. Interesting, 7 times. We realize that in Scripture, 7 is a symbolic number that represents fullness or completeness. So when we see the number 7 in Scripture, we should immediately think of fullness, completeness, wholeness. We see in the book of Genesis 1:4 that this is the first time Ki Tov is mentioned, when light is created. On day 3, specifically in the creation of the land and the sea, it says this in Genesis 1:10. Again, on the third day, there are 2 expressions of Ki Tov, which we see when vegetation appears. This is in Genesis 1:12. On day 4, when the lights are created, Genesis 1:18. On day 5, when the sea creatures and birds appear, Genesis 1:21. On day 6, the land animals in Genesis 1:25. And finally, again on day 6, when creation and mankind are completed, that is in Genesis 1:31. If you'd like, you can pause the video so you can verify the passages for yourself and confirm that this is indeed how God established it in His Scripture. With this entire design that I am presenting to you, I am literally telling you that creation as a whole ends up being Tov. That is why I said in the previous video that we are part of creation, and as part of creation, we must live in harmony. Creation has a harmony that must be respected. People who do not respect animals, people who do not respect other human beings, that goes against the design that God established and that we should return to. There is something even more impressive in all of this. It turns out that if we look at the word Tov in Hebrew, it has a particular feature called its geometric value, what is known as gematria. Later, we will explain more about what gematria is. Some of you may already be familiar with the concept. If we take the value of each of the letters in Tov, the final result is 17. The sum of the 3 characters equals 17. If I take this number 17 and I multiply it by the 7 days of creation, where we saw the 7 instances of Tov within creation, 17 times 7 equals 119. It is very interesting to see that Psalm 119, written by King David, is precisely the longest chapter, and it was dedicated to Scripture as light for the conscience. This is important, the light, Ki Tov, and now we see Scripture as a light for the conscience. We also mentioned the concept of conscience earlier and left it as something we would explore later. This numerical pattern has fascinated many Bible scholars. When they see it, they recognize it as a beautiful revelation. Here it is presented to you. The word Tov is composed of 3 Hebrew letters. Bet, the first, with a numerical value of 9. Vav, the sixth, with a numerical value of 6. Bet, the second, with a numerical value of 2. So if I add 9 plus 6, that equals 15, plus 2, that equals 17. That is why in Scripture 17 is symbolically associated with goodness, fullness, blessing, and restored harmony. So notice how important this concept is, and once again we see fullness. This means that 17 and 7 are connected. A person who lives in 7 is said to live in blessing and to be morally restored with a perfect design. This pattern of 17 appears in the story of Joseph. We all know Joseph, the son of Jacob, a historical figure who went through a very difficult process in his life. A well-known example appears in Genesis 37:2. You can pause and read it. It says that Joseph was 17 years old when his story begins. Let's remember the story. Joseph was sent by his father to check on his brothers. During one of these journeys, he has dreams and tells his brothers, I dreamed about you. He says that in the dream their sheaves bow down to his. Another dream describes the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowing down to him. This angered them so much that even his father rebuked him. This is fascinating because his life goes through three stages: the beginning, at age 17, with the dream, the betrayal by his brothers, who sell him into slavery in Egypt, and restoration and the salvation of his family. Joseph's story shows that Tov can be hidden during chaos, but ultimately Tov is always revealed. That is why Joseph represents the idea that divine goodness can be at work even in suffering. Could it be that my suffering has something hidden that I cannot see? Is there a lack of activation of Tov in me, preventing me from seeing what is happening behind the scenes? I complain about everything, I see everything as bad. Where does the concept of bad come from? How can I say that something designed for me is bad if in the end it benefits me? How can I say that studying hard as a child is bad if in the end I graduate and am rewarded? When we learn to change the idea of this is bad into everything that happens is for my benefit, does our thinking change? Do we begin to see things differently? Let's look at the number 17 and the flood. In the story of Noah in Genesis 7:11, we find out that the flood begins on the 17th day of the month. Then, in Genesis 8:4, the ark stops on the 17th day. So in Noah's story, we see two instances of 17, one at the beginning of chaos and one at the beginning of restoration. Isn't that what happened with Joseph at 17? This suggests a profound idea. Divine goodness can operate even within judgment. We also have the story of Jacob. Jacob lived his last 17 years in Egypt. This pattern appears again at the end of his life, as seen in Genesis 47:28. After his sons go down to Egypt to buy food, they discover that Joseph is alive and is the governor of Egypt. They return and tell their father, your son Joseph is not dead, he is in Egypt. Jacob goes down and finds it to be true, and the story says that those years were the best of his life. After chaos, suffering, and agony, he recovers that design, finally experiencing familiar shalom. Do you remember what shalom meant? Not just peace, but fullness. Once again, the pattern of 17 appears, the restoration of what Jacob had lost. How interesting it is to see how 17 and 7 are connected and tied to the concept of Ki Tov. What is Scripture teaching us? What is it trying to form in us? How do I find this within the first day, the second day, all the way to the seventh day in Genesis chapter 1? What is the creator of all things trying to tell me that I cannot yet see literally? I invite you to the third video so we can continue this study, which will begin to transform our being. Shalom.